HMS Queen Elizabeth, the lead ship of the Queen Elizabeth class of battleships. She would begin her career on December 22nd, 1914. She would fight in 2 world wars and would see service all over the world from the Indian Ocean to the North Atlantic, and would eventually be sold for scrap in May of 1948. But to get back to the start of her story, it actually would begin with the estimates for 1912 and 1913. As the Royal Navy was looking for designs to create a fast battleship squadron that would embody maximum offensive firepower and adequate protection with a top speed of at least 2 or 3 knots faster than any other battleship, with 25 knots being the minimum required. To meet the requirement for speed, the Queen Elizabeth class would be the first to burn all oil fuel, as the advantages were truly overwhelming. As the steaming radius was greater, speed could be increased more rapidly and maintained much easier. The refueling process was much easier, and finally, with the lack of smoke, it would make it easier to close in on enemies. Although, the decision was still made with great apprehension, as there were concerns about the maintenance of supplies during wartime, so much so the succeeding class of royal sovereigns were fitted with mixed coal and oil fuel arrangements. To meet the requirement for maximum offensive firepower, they would use the new 14-inch experimental gun. For secrecy's sake, this is what the 15-inch gun was called. The design would call for 8 Mark I 15-inch guns, which would exceed expectations in their service life, being one of the most efficient heavy-caliber naval guns ever produced. The original design called for a secondary battery of 16 6-inch guns, as compared to the 12 found in the Iron Duke class, the predecessor to the Queen Elizabeth class. Queen Elizabeth would be complete with all 16 of these guns, which would be cut down to 14. While the armor was on a similar scale to the Iron Duke class, but with provisions for thicker armor at the waterline and lower decks, turrets and anti-torpedo bulkheads, as well as reductions on the middle and upper side strakes, upper side bulkheads, and main and middle deck levels. Queen Elizabeth would be laid down on October 21st, 1912, launched on October 13th, 1913, and completed on January 1st, 1914. As completed, she would weigh around 27,000 tons and have a full load displacement of about 32,500 tons. Her machinery would be comprised of 24 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, giving steam to Parsons turbines, giving her a maximum design shaft horsepower of 75,000 and a design maximum speed of 25 knots. As for armament, she would carry 8 15-inch 42 caliber guns and twin turrets, with 2 super firing forward and 2 aft. Her secondary battery would be comprised of 16 6-inch guns, which, as I already mentioned, would be brought down to 14. She would also carry 2 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 4 3-pounder saluting guns, 10 Lewis guns, and 4 underwater torpedo tubes. As for armor, she would have a main belt with a maximum thickness of 13 inches, bulkheads of 6.4 inches. The decks would vary in thickness, but the main deck would be between 1.25 inch and 2 inches. Barbettes of between 4 inches and 10 inches. Her turrets would have a face thickness of 13 inches, with the rear, sides, and roof varying between 4.25 inch and 11 inches. A conning tower with a maximum thickness of 11 inches. On December 22, 1914, she was commissioned for independent service at Portsmouth and was working up until February 1915, and was readying to be sent to the Mediterranean to calibrate her guns. When First Sea Lord of the Admiralty, Jackie Fisher, suggested that she be sent to the Dardanelles to assist in the bombardments of the Straits, instead of, quote, firing all of her ammunition uselessly into the sea at Gibraltar, end quote. The idea for the campaign was for the battleships screened by destroyers and other smaller vessels equipped with minesweeping gear to force their way through the narrow waterway defended by forts with heavy guns and numerous batteries of mobile howitzers to the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, to hopefully knock them out of the war and regain contact and trade with their Russian allies through the Black Sea, as the situation for the Russians at the time was less than ideal. The bombardment force would consist of older pre-dreadnought battleships and Queen Elizabeth. Although it was Fisher's idea, in mid-January of 1915, he would start to show a sense of unease about sending the new powerful battleship and bombardment mission as a whole. As the last week of January began, the ships and supplies were assembled and ready to go. Fisher's apprehension had grown in the past several weeks, leading to his withdrawal of support for the mission and resignation from his post on the morning of January 28th. Fisher had tried to convince the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, and other members of the War Cabinet against going through with the bombardment mission. Fisher, Churchill, and Prime Minister Henry Asquith would meet before the War Cabinet meeting to discuss whether or not the mission should be carried out. The Prime Minister decided that it would happen, and later the War Cabinet approved it. Although Fisher accepted the decision, he would still prefer a joint assault rather than the purely naval one that was going to occur. Even with the First Sea Lord's misgivings, Queen Elizabeth, with several limitations placed on her by the Admiralty, would be given to Admiral Carden as well as the battlecruiser Inflexible and an assortment of British and French pre-dreadnoughts, with main battery guns of between 10 and 12 inches. The force would be sent to the advanced base, which was the Greek island of Mudros. On the 19th of February, Carden's assault was to begin, where they would bombard the outer forts of the Straits. Queen Elizabeth, with some delay due to an incident off Gibraltar, on February 25th, along with the pre-dreadnoughts Agamemnon, Irresistible, and Gaulois, continued the bombardment of the outer forts at a range of 12,000 yards. Queen Elizabeth fired 18 15-inch shells, one by one, as she was not to fire full salvos. She would score 2 direct hits and destroy 2 guns. Although the Turkish defenses were stiff, the outer forts would fall by the first week of March, and the Allies commanded the entrance to the straits. News of this would cause panic in the streets of Constantinople, fearing that the British battleships would soon bombard the city. However, the Allies would still have their work cut out for them. Another restriction placed on Queen Elizabeth would be the fact that she was prohibited from entering the straits. This restriction would soon be lifted. So on the 5th of March, she anchored off the Aegean coast of Gallipoli and fired her large guns over the peninsula at the Narrows forts, causing confusion amongst the ranks of the Turkish soldiers in their pre-prepared defenses, as they were protected from fire coming up the straits, not at this unexpected angle. So, the following day, when Queen Elizabeth returned to continue her bombardment of the Narrows forts, she was met by a battery of mobile 6-inch howitzers. She would be hit multiple times, 3 of them striking the ship below the waterline, causing almost no damage to the ship itself. Some of the fleet were already beginning to question the method of bombardment, as it seemed that the Turkish defenses were too stout to make it through the Narrows without considerable losses, as the straits had been mined heavily, and with the fire from the guns from the Ottoman positions, the Allies were struggling to make any ground. Admiral Carden, due to illness, would be replaced by Admiral de Robeck as acting admiral, and chose Queen Elizabeth as his flagship. With that, a plan was set in motion for the following day, which had already been previously drawn up, where battleships would cover the minesweepers as they cleared a path through the straits. On the morning of March 18th, the armada of 18 battleships, including Queen Elizabeth, steamed toward the Dardanelles to silence the Turkish guns by long-range gunfire. Queen Elizabeth was to play a central role along with the 3 other most powerful ships in de Robeck's fleet. Agamemnon, Lord Nelson, and Inflexible were to take positions side by side across the straits at 14,000 yards and begin to bombard the forts, along with 2 other pre-dreadnoughts, Prince George and Triumph. They were to make the first line out of 3 to attack the Dardanelles. At 10:30 a.m., Queen Elizabeth and the other 11 battleships of lines A and B entered the straits and carefully made their way through the waters, making it to 14,000 yards away from the Chanak forts, and at 11:25 a.m., Queen Elizabeth began to open fire, and by 11:50, the Chanak forts were taking a serious pounding from the combined firepower of the battleships. Line B moved up and began to fire as well, but the Turkish forts would fight back, hitting the battleships numerous times. Queen Elizabeth would not be hit during this bombardment. However, as the afternoon wore on, the Allied forces began to sustain losses, with several old pre-dreadnoughts being sunk, and other capital ships like Inflexible being damaged and forced to withdraw. After HMS Irresistible hit a mine, de Robeck decided to call off the action for the day and have the fleet withdraw. With that, Queen Elizabeth would participate in a very limited amount of further operations in the Dardanelles campaign. As on the bridge, discussions about the campaign as a whole would take place, after which it was decided that it should be a combined campaign with the Army and Navy. Notably, on the 27th of April, she would fire on the German battlecruiser Goeben by indirect fire off Nagara, using a kite balloon for spotting. By early May, there was cause for concern about the possibility of Queen Elizabeth being attacked, especially after the torpedoing of HMS Goliath. This would cause the Admiralty to take action. Fisher, in agreement with Churchill, would recall Queen Elizabeth on the 12th to be replaced by monitors carrying 14-inch guns. She would make her way back to Gibraltar and on to Scapa Flow, where she would join her sisters in the 5th Battle Squadron. By May of 1916, the 5th Battle Squadron was to join Admiral Beatty's battlecruiser force as a stopgap, as the battlecruisers stationed at the Firth of Forth lacked a gunnery range. So, squadron by squadron, they went to Scapa Flow to practice gunnery. So, in the meantime, in case of inaction, the 5th Battle Squadron, having the speed sufficient to keep up with the battlecruisers, could be on hand. Upon arriving at the Firth of Forth, Queen Elizabeth went into Rosyth Dockyard, leaving Admiral Beatty with 4 of the powerful super dreadnoughts. Because of that, Queen Elizabeth would miss the Battle of Jutland, being in dry dock during the battle, and would be removed from dry dock once Warspite returned due to the damage she sustained during the battle. After Admiral Beatty succeeded Jellicoe as Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Fleet, and not finding Iron Duke as welcoming as he would like, Beatty would transfer his flag to the newer, bigger, and faster Queen Elizabeth. At this point, from November 1916 to February 1917, she would be refit at Newcastle to fulfill this new role. The remainder of the war would be relatively mundane for Queen Elizabeth, as there was no other major naval engagement between the High Seas Fleet and Grand Fleet following Jutland. Although the two fleets would sortie numerous times, and even though they came close several times, the two never actually engaged one another again in a full fleet action. Following the armistice on November 11, 1918, another naval armistice was signed aboard Queen Elizabeth on the 15th of November, and taking from Castles of Steel, Britain, Germany, and the winning of the Great War at Sea by Robert K. Massey, he writes, "At 7 o'clock on the evening of November 15th, Moira, Germany's representative, and 4 other German officers walked up the gangplank of Queen Elizabeth. Around them, a black night and thick fog in the Firth of Forth hid the shapes and lights of the rows of dreadnoughts near Beatty's flagship. Reaching the quarterdeck, Moira was received in silence by 2 British officers, assigned to escort him to the commander-in-chief. Powerful electric lights created a path across the quarterdeck to Beatty's quarters. Outside the path, everything was darkness, but along its edge stood a line of marine sentries, light gleaming off the steel of their fixed bayonets. Beatty and his officers sat at a large dining room table, with their backs to a wall hung with prints of Nelson's victories. A small bronze lion was on the table, a reminder of the Admiral's years with the battle cruisers. Following the Great War and the subsequent breakup of the Grand Fleet, Queen Elizabeth would remain the flagship of the newly created Atlantic Fleet. In 1919, in April, Beatty would be promoted to Admiral of the Fleet and hoisted the Union Jack in Queen Elizabeth. Following her service as flagship of the Atlantic Fleet, she would be transferred to the Mediterranean Fleet in November of 1924, although she was president at the Spithead Review on the 26th of July, 1924. She would serve as the flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet until May of 1926, when she was relieved by Warspite to go to Portsmouth for reconstruction, where she was until December of 1927. In the reconstruction, she would have torpedo bulges added, which would mean the removal of her torpedo tubes, along with the enlargement of her bridge and the trunking of her funnels merged into a single uptake. Due to the changes in the bridge work, her fire control arrangements would be modified to fit these new accommodations, as well as the replacement of her anti-aircraft guns. Here's a table from R.A. Burt's book, British Battleships 1919 to 1945, which illustrates her changes post-1927 refit. Following this refit, she would return to the Mediterranean and serve as flagship from January 1928 until August of 1937. In October of 1929, she, along with HMS Courageous, Wanderer, Wild Swan, Veteran, and Brioni, would visit Constantinople, the first time a British squadron entered Turkish waters following the signing of the peace treaty. In November, she would head to Portsmouth for more refits, in which a fire control system was fitted for anti-aircraft weapons, with a high-angle director on the foretop. She would become flagship of the Mediterranean Fleet again in May of 1930, and in July, along with Ramillies, would support local forces in suppressing an uprising in Alexandria. In November of 1932, she would go for another refit, where the aircraft catapult fit to B turret would be removed. Then, from October of 1935 until the summer of 1936, she'd be stationed in Alexandria during the Italo-Ethiopian crisis. By August of 1937, she was relieved once more, this time by Barham, and sent to Portsmouth for an extensive overhaul and refit. Her existing 25 boilers were replaced by 8 Admiralty Type 3 drum boilers, as well as the fitting of new turbines. The main armament elevation was modified to 30 degrees, thus increasing the range of the guns substantially. In the same vein, new fire control equipment for the main battery was fitted. The entire 6-inch battery was replaced by 10 dual-purpose 4.5-inch guns in twin mountings. Close-range anti-aircraft guns were added as well, including octuple 2-pounder pom-pom guns, as well as 4 quadruple half-inch machine guns. Her bridge would be completely redesigned. On top of that, she would have an aircraft catapult and aircraft storage added. She would also have radar equipment installed. Her reconstruction was on similar lines to that of Valiant, the differences being very minimal. Because of the weight increase, Queen Elizabeth weighed around 38,000 tons, and because of that, her top speed was limited to 23.5 knots. Her reconstruction would last until early 1941. Now, obviously, we could discuss the reconstruction in a lot more detail, and we will discuss it at some point, but for the sake of continuing the story, let's move on. In December of 1940, during her reconstruction, she would actually be transferred from Portsmouth to Rosyth because of the threat of air attacks. She would be recommissioned on January 31st, 1941 in Rosyth as part of the 2nd Battle Squadron. She would continue her working up to be fully ready for combat. Until May, she would work with the Home Fleet in an attempt to catch German commerce raiders in the Atlantic, as the German ships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were conducting Operation Berlin. She would participate in other operations like convoy escort, notably TC-10 in April. She would first venture into the Mediterranean on May the 6th, as part of a convoy heading to Malta and onto Alexandria. Although the convoy would be attacked from the air, but they would make their way to Alexandria and arrive on the 12th. On the 14th, Queen Elizabeth would head to Crete to assist in its defense, whether from air or from attacks from the Regia Marina. For the next 2 weeks, she would help to fend off air attacks from the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica. Following the German invasion and the Allied evacuation of Crete, Queen Elizabeth participated in the evacuation, eventually returning to Alexandria in late May, where she would spend most of June and only venture out late in the month for fleet exercises. Notably, in July, she would sail into the eastern Mediterranean as part of an effort to divert Axis forces from a relief convoy heading to Malta. She would sail as part of another diversion in September, and the same would occur in November. On December 19th, 1941, 2 Italian frogmen slipped through the defenses in Alexandria and placed explosives estimated to be about 500 pounds worth on Queen Elizabeth, wherein a powerful explosion occurred under the area of B boiler room, causing that boiler room to flood immediately, followed by A boiler room, X boiler room, number 1 and 2 dynamo rooms, A and B hydraulic rooms, and a few other compartments, causing the ship to list about 4.5 degrees. Upon docking, the following main items of damage affecting fighting efficiency were found. 1. Ship unseaworthy. 2. A, B, and X boiler rooms are out of action. 3. All evaporators are out of action. 4. 2 hydraulic pumps are out of action. 5. All low-pressure compressors are out of action. 6. Numbers 1, 2, and 3 high-pressure compressors are out of action. 7. All oil fuel tanks abreast of A, B, and X boiler rooms are out of action. 8. Main engine telegraphs are out of action. 9. Forward 4.5-inch turrets, except S3, are out of action through flooded pumps and distorted roller bearing paths. 10. Only 40% of stowage is available in the lower center 4.5-inch magazine. 11. Forward sections of main ring are out of action. 12. Numbers 1, 2, 3, and 5 dynamos are out of action. 13. Number 2 transmitting room out of action. 14. Only 1 set of machinery available for each transmitting room. 15. Both automatic plots are out of action. Here's a great illustration from R.A. Burt's British Battleships 1919 to 1945 that illustrates the damage from the explosion. Between January and June of 1942, Queen Elizabeth was under repairs in Alexandria in preparation for her journey to the USA for permanent repairs. On the 27th, she sailed for Port Said and then on to Aden, then on to Durban and Cape Town, finally ending up in Norfolk, Virginia, where she was taken in for permanent repairs, where she would be until June of 1943, when she would be recommissioned on the 1st, leaving for the Home Fleet on the 26th and arriving on the 9th of July in Devonport. She would spend the next several months working up with the Home Fleet to be eventually transferred to the Eastern Fleet in December of 1943, arriving at Trincomalee on the 28th of January 1944 and becoming the fleet flagship for Admiral Somerville. For the next several months, the Eastern Fleet would do exercises to prepare for fighting against Japan. The Eastern Fleet would contain HMS Queen Elizabeth, Valiant, Renown, and Illustrious. Along with their escorting cruisers and destroyers, they would be joined by USS Saratoga on the 27th of March. In April, the Eastern Fleet would leave Trincomalee on the 16th to carry out an air attack on Sabang, which is just off the northern coast of Sumatra. The planes would fly off on the 19th. Following this up, they would carry out a bombardment of Car Nicobar and Port Blair in the Andaman Islands chain. The next month, on the 17th, Queen Elizabeth would help to escort Illustrious and Saratoga attack Surabaya, where they would meet resistance from Japanese surface forces. Next, in July, she, along with Valiant, Renown, Richelieu and their escorting destroyers would bombard Sabang after supporting another air attack from Illustrious and Victorious. In October, she would be refit in Durban and remain there until the 22nd of November, where she would remain in Southeast Asia and become part of the redesignated East Indies Fleet, where in 1945 she participated in more bombardments of Sabang in January and then conducted missions in Burma until July of 1945, where she was relieved by Rodney, arriving in Portsmouth on the 7th of August 1945. After this, she became an accommodation ship at Portland and Portsmouth, finally being placed in reserve in March of 1946 and broken up in 1948. I hope you all have enjoyed this look at HMS Queen Elizabeth. She's truly a fascinating ship whose story isn't as well known as some of her sister ships like Warspite. I understand there could be more detailed explanations for some parts, but I tried to make this video more manageable to watch and for me to create. Anyway, don't forget to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow, and until next time my friends, good luck this week.